15th May 1944. Versuchsstelle Peenemünde, Baltic coast, Germany. The morning fog lifted slowly from the pine forest surrounding the test range as Oberleutnant Werner Krause stood beside the launch rail, his hands numb despite the leather gloves, watching the technicians from Henschel Flugzeugwerk make final adjustments to the HS-117 prototype, positioned at a 45-degree angle on its mobile launcher. The missile measured just over 4 meters in length, its cruciform wings and tail surfaces painted in the standard factory primer. The twin solid-fuel booster rockets mounted beneath the fuselage, still cold to the touch in the dawn air. Krause had been assigned to Flakversuchskommando 217 3 weeks earlier, transferred from a heavy flak battery outside Hamburg, where his unit had expended over 2,000 88mm shells in a single month against the American daylight raids, achieving only 7 confirmed kills, a ratio that had made the need for weapons like the Schmetterling painfully evident to anyone who understood mathematics and attrition. The radio guidance system operator, a pallid Gefreiter named Host, who had previously worked at Telefunken, sat in the control bunker 60 meters back from the rail, his hands resting on the Kael Strasbourg transmitter joystick, the receiver unit in the missile's tail section, tuned to 47 MHz and tested twice already that morning. At 0847 hours, the range officer gave clearance. The weather observer reported ceiling at 800 meters with wind from the northwest at 12 kilometers per hour, and Krause raised his hand in signal, the ignition sequence beginning with a metallic click that echoed across the concrete apron. The boosters ignited with a sound like tearing canvas, amplified 1,000 times, white smoke erupting in twin columns as the Schmetterling leapt from the rail, climbing at an angle that seemed too steep until the Schmitting 109543 sustainer motor kicked in at 200 meters altitude, and the boosters fell away, tumbling into the marsh grass below. Holst's voice came through the field telephone, calm and technical, calling out altitude and trajectory as he worked the joystick. The flare on the missile's tail section visible even in the morning light as it arced across the sky toward the target, a weather balloon released 10 minutes earlier, now drifting at 600 meters. The Schmetterling's speed built to over 900 kilometers per hour, faster than any manned fighter could intercept, its Kronisch acoustic proximity fuse activated and listening for the sound signature of aircraft engines, though today it would be detonated by radio command if the approach looked promising. Krause tracked the missile through his binoculars, noting the oscillation in its flight path, the overcorrections that suggested the guidance system's response time was still too slow for a target making evasive maneuvers, a problem the engineers had promised to resolve but which persisted through 17 previous tests. At 18 seconds after launch, with the Schmetterling passing 300 meters from the balloon, Holst transmitted the detonation signal, and the warhead, 25 kilograms of amatol, exploded in a dark flower of smoke and shrapnel that shredded the balloon and sent fragments spinning toward Earth. The report would list the test as erfolgreich, successful, though Krause knew that a balloon was not a B-17 Flying Fortress, coming in at 7,000 meters with a closing speed that would give the guidance operator perhaps 30 seconds to acquire, track, and intercept. And he knew also that the solid fuel motors were in short supply, that each test consumed resources that might not be replaced, that the Kael Strasbourg system could be jammed by the Allies once they understood its frequency range, and that even if every technical problem were solved tomorrow, the war had already moved beyond the point where a weapon like this could change outcomes, only delay them. He walked back toward the bunker as the recovery crews moved out to collect the debris, his boots crunching on gravel, the smell of burnt propellant still heavy in the air, and he thought of the crews in Hamburg and Berlin and Schweinfurt who fired their 88mm guns night after night at bombers they could barely see, and he wondered if the Schmetterling would ever reach them in time, or in sufficient numbers, to matter at all. 22 August 1944. Luftwaffe Test Center, Karlshagen, Usedom Island, Germany. The tactical evaluation began at 14:20 hours under conditions that better approximated combat reality, with a Junkers Ju-88 G-1 night fighter from Nachtjagdgeschwader 3 flying a simulated bomber profile at 4,500 meters altitude, speed 280 kilometers per hour, while Hauptmann Erich Vandenberg commanded the battery of 4 HS-117 launch rails positioned in a clearing that had been cut from the coastal forest 3 months earlier. Vandenberg had flown Mech 109s over France in 1940 and knew what it meant to engage an enemy at high speed with limited ammunition, and he understood that the Schmetterling represented a different philosophy entirely: standoff engagement, radio guidance, proximity detonation, a weapon that kept the operator on the ground while sending explosives into the sky. Though whether this made it more or less honorable than single combat at 300 meters, he had stopped asking himself. The Würzburg Riese radar installation 2 kilometers inland had acquired the Ju-88 at 28 kilometers range, its data fed by landline to Vandenberg's command post, where Luftwaffe signals corporal plotted the intercept geometry on a glass board with a grease pencil, calculating the lead angle required to bring missile and aircraft together in the same cubic kilometer of sky. Rail 1 was prepared first, its HS-117 missile armed and fueled, the Schmetterling motor's fuel grain loaded with a mixture that burned hotter than previous tests, an adjustment that had increased range to 18 kilometers but also increased the risk of structural failure during high-G maneuvers. At 14:27 hours, Vandenberg gave the order, and the first Schmetterling launched, its roar splitting the afternoon quiet, white exhaust trail drawing a line across the pale August sky as the guidance operator, Feldwebel Kessler, a former Lufthansa radio technician, acquired the flare and began transmitting corrections. The Ju-88 was visible now, a dark cross against scattered cumulus, its pilot Lieutenant Strom under orders to maintain course and altitude until the last possible moment, simulating the kind of disciplined formation flying the American heavy bombers used over Germany. Kessler's corrections came in small increments, voice tight with concentration as he called out relative bearing and rate of closure, the missile climbing through 4,000 meters and still accelerating, its trajectory bending gradually toward the intercept point. At 9 kilometers range, the acoustic proximity fuse activated, its microphone listening for the Jumo 211 engines, and at 4 kilometers, Strom finally broke left in a diving turn, standard evasion for a bomber under fighter attack, and the Schmetterling followed but too slowly, its control surfaces unable to match the turn radius, and it passed 200 meters behind the Ju-88's tail before Kessler could correct, the proximity fuse silent, the warhead inert, as the missile continued on a ballistic arc until the sustainer burned out and it fell toward the Baltic, impacting the water at 14:29 hours and 32 seconds. Rail 2 launched at 14:31 hours with the Ju-88 now heading southwest at 3,000 meters, and this time Kessler anticipated the evasion, leading the target by 3 degrees, and the Schmetterling curved through the sky like something alive, its speed building to 940 kilometers per hour as the sustainer reached peak thrust. Strom broke right this time, harder than before, and the missile followed through the turn, closing range to 120 meters before the proximity fuse detected the engine noise and sent the detonation signal, the warhead exploding in a sphere of flame and steel that would have shredded any aircraft within lethal radius, though the Ju-88 was just outside it and continued flying, trailing only a thin stream of coolant from a punctured radiator. Vandenberg noted the results in his log, the ink smudging slightly in the humidity, and authorized rails 3 and 4 to launch in a salvo, both missiles away within 2 seconds of each other, their trails intertwining as they climbed, and Kessler and his backup operator guided them both toward the target, now heading northwest at full military power, Strom pushing the Jumo engines to emergency boost and jinking every 8 seconds. And one missile lost guidance at 7 kilometers when Kessler overcorrected and the flare disappeared behind a cloud deck, but the second stayed locked, following the Ju-88 through a steep climbing turn until the range closed to 80 meters and the fuse fired, the explosion close enough that Strom reported control difficulties over the radio before stabilizing and heading back to Peenemünde with shrapnel holes in the starboard wing and tail surfaces. The tactical evaluation report would conclude that the HS-117 showed promise against non-evading targets at medium altitude, but required improved guidance response time and either a larger warhead or more sensitive proximity fuse to ensure kills against maneuvering aircraft. And it would note that operational deployment would require approximately 40 missiles per battery, with trained guidance operators and dedicated radar queuing, resources that were increasingly difficult to allocate as the Allied armies crossed France and the Eastern Front collapsed toward the Reich's borders. 18 January 1945. Flak Battery Position Süd 7, outskirts of Dresden, Germany. The snow had been falling since midnight, accumulating in drifts against the sandbagged walls of the guidance bunker, where Unteroffizier Paul Richter sat with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of ersatz coffee, watching the Würzburg dish rotate slowly through the darkness, its motor whining in the cold. Battery Süd 7 had received 12 HS-117 Schmetterling missiles 3 weeks earlier, delivered by rail from the Henschel plant at Berlin-Schönefeld, along with a 2-day crash course in operating procedures. And Richter had fired exactly none of them in combat, because the American bomber formations had not come within range of Dresden since before Christmas. Their priorities shifted to targets farther west, oil refineries and rail yards and troop concentrations in the path of the final offensive everyone knew was coming. The battery consisted of 4 launch rails positioned in a rough square 200 meters on a side, each rail manned by a 3-man crew who lived in dugouts lined with pine branches and heated by scavenged coal, their faces gray with exhaustion and poor rations, most of them veterans of the 88mm flak batteries that had been overrun in France or transferred east, where they had fired their last shells at Soviet ground attack aircraft before retreating into Germany with whatever equipment could be saved. Richter had operated the Kehl-Strasbourg transmitter at Peenemünde during the test program and understood the weapon's capabilities and limitations better than most, knew that the guidance system's effective range was perhaps 12 kilometers under ideal conditions, less in bad weather or if the target was jamming, and that each missile had a flight time of less than 90 seconds before the sustainer burned out and left it ballistic and useless. At 0340 hours, the Würzburg operator, a middle-aged Obergerfighter named Lenz, who had been pulled from a radio repair depot in Bavaria, reported contact bearing 270 degrees, range 42 kilometers, altitude estimated 6,000 meters, multiple contacts in formation, velocity 400 kilometers per hour. Richter set down his coffee and moved to the guidance station, pulling on his headset as the battery commander Major Kepler came through the blast door, snow melting on his greatcoat, his face unreadable in the red light of the bunker. The contacts were RAF heavy bombers, Lancaster or Halifax types, part of a raid heading southeast toward targets in Saxony. And Kepler ordered all 4 rails to prepare for launch with a 10-second interval between missiles to allow separate guidance channels. The crews scrambled through the snow to their positions, removing the protective tarpaulins from the missiles and connecting the electrical umbilicals, their breath visible in the pre-dawn darkness as they worked with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this 100 times in drills, but never in combat. At 0347 hours, the Würzburg operator showed the formation at 31 kilometers range, still inbound, and Kepler gave the order to commence firing, his voice calm over the field telephone network. Rail 1 fired first, the Schmetterling leaping from its launcher with a sound like rolling thunder, the twin boosters illuminating the snow-covered landscape in harsh white light as the missile climbed toward the cloud deck at 800 meters. Richter acquired the flare immediately, his eyes locked on the small point of light rising through the falling snow, and he began transmitting guidance corrections, the joystick movement small and precise as he brought the missile onto an intercept course. Rails 2, 3, and 4 followed at intervals, their combined roar echoing off the hills east of Dresden, and the guidance operators worked their separate targets as the missiles climbed through 3,000 meters, 4,000, 5,000, the flares growing dimmer with distance and altitude, but still visible, still trackable. At 17 kilometers range, Richter's missile was passing through 5,500 meters altitude when the flare disappeared, not extinguished but lost behind a cloud bank that had not been visible from the ground, and he held his course correction steady, hoping the Schmetterling would emerge on the other side, but it never did, the clouds too thick, the flare too dim, and after 30 seconds he reported lost guidance and watched his missile fall away somewhere over the Elbe Valley. Rails 2 and 3 reported similar difficulties, their targets obscured by weather, but Rail 4's operator, a young Gefreiter whose name Richter did not know, stayed locked on his flare and guided his missile to within 8 kilometers of the bomber formation before the Würzburg operator called out chaff, hundreds of metallic strips falling through the sky and blooming across his radar screen like snow, the RAF standard countermeasure, and the tracking solution dissolved into noise. Not one of the 4 Schmetterlings reached detonation range, and by 0351 hours, all had either lost guidance or run out of fuel and fallen into the darkness below, and the Lancaster bombers continued southeast toward their target, untouched and perhaps unaware that they had been engaged at all. Kepler stood in the bunker doorway smoking a cigarette, watching the snow fall. And after a long silence, he told Richter to prepare a report for division headquarters, a technical assessment of the engagement, including weather conditions, guidance difficulties, and recommendations for future operations, though they both knew there would be no future operations. That the 12 missiles in Battery Zud 7's inventory represented the sum total of Germany's strategic air defense capability in this sector, and that when those 12 were gone, there would be nothing to replace them except the same 88mm guns and the same tired crews who had been fighting this losing battle since 1943. Richter began writing the report by hand, his fingers stiff with cold, noting the visibility at time of launch, the cloud ceiling, the range at which guidance was lost, the presence of chaff, all the technical details that would be filed and forgotten in some headquarters bunker before the month was out. And he thought about the Schmetterling's clean lines and its impressive speed and the tremendous effort that had gone into its development. And he thought about how none of it mattered now, how the war had moved beyond the point where clever weapons and dedicated crews could change anything. And he finished his report as the sun rose pale and weak over Dresden, the city quiet under its blanket of snow, unaware that in exactly 4 weeks it would burn in a firestorm that no missile system, however advanced, could have prevented.